As part of our gateway into graphic novels, I've included here in week 1, and I've just posted this underneath our first discussion forum, a link to Scott McCloud, which will take you to this location where I have some breakdown PowerPoint of his work. But I wanted to share with you, this is mainly a resource that I typically in a normal 16-week class would discuss in more detail with you. But this is literally a graphic novel about what exactly graphic novels and comics are. Alright, and it's broken down into 9 chapters. I think the most particularly engaging ones are particularly chapters 2, 3, 4, and then particularly chapters 5 and 8 are really good, and of course chapter 9. Chapter 8's a little expendable. It talks about color, but he's basically illustrating, and he uses an avatar, which for any of you who've seen what I do, you recognize this. Some of the stuff you'll see from me engages some of the same avatar, but he talks directly to the audience. He talks about what comics are in chapter 1. In particular, he talks about this difference between still images and images laid out together. I'll hit some highlights here. He does lay out a definition for what comics are, particularly this idea of juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. And what he basically means by this is that these 2 panels here are images that are juxtaposed. They're put side by side. They're done so in a particular order that's designed to communicate information he's communicating information here, but it could also not only communicate information, it could also simply be aesthetically pleasing, which is to say you find it something that your eye finds attractive. The common example that I like to use is let's see, I think I'll correct his name. Yeah, J. Lee Art. Let's just start that. Yeah. I like to use this because this is one of those situations where one of my best friends and I disagree. This right here, this is his art style. And if you take a look at it, it's very distinct. And I find it aesthetically pleasing, but I know people who don't. And that's an example of this whole notion of the aesthetically pleasing elements. And of course, comic books can both convey information and be aesthetically pleasing, or they can do one or the other. And then he traces a whole backstory here about going back to hieroglyphics and the Bayeux Tapestry and about how this has kind of been with us for a very long time. And then he talks about the divergences between the art world and the written word and things like that. And that carries over, of course, into chapter 2, where he starts talking about different terminology. He lays out this idea of what he calls icons and the scale of representation. All kinds of interesting stuff. So if you find yourself struggling a little bit with understanding some of the comics and how comics and graphic novels function, you might want to glance over some of his stuff, or if not, look at this graphic novel itself. Take a moment and glance at the PowerPoints that I've got that go along with it that break down some of the information here. He goes on for quite a bit here, and then he gets into this whole triangle thing that I find very interesting. I've always been a fan of this representation triangle. Okay, between reality over here, meaning over here, and words, and then there's the picture plane where things get really abstract. Of course, he then talks about how to reconcile this, and then he talks about the gutter space in between panels. He goes on to talk about time and relationship as well. He talks about different kinds of transitions between panels. All kinds of stuff that gets kind of technical, but it can be useful and interesting, particularly if you find yourself struggling with some of the material as we go through the course. So I would take a recommendation that you look at this further, either glancing over some of his chapters, maybe honing in on some of the things that he talks about. For example, if you think about the chapter breakdowns, chapter 2 is about vocabulary. Chapter 3 is about the gutter space, which is between panels. Chapter 4 is about time frames, living in the line, show and tell, 6 steps, word about color, and putting it all together. If nothing else, check out chapters 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 9. If you do nothing else, that would be something worth your time, just as a glancing over, and that could be useful to you while you're unpacking and digging into your own graphic novel and becoming a little bit more familiar. And I hope this is helpful.